This is a talk. If I go through it straight, it'll take about 25 minutes. I hope that's okay. It would be great if people intervened with their own comments or questions or things that they wanted to put in front of the wider group. As Andy's just said, probably best to do that through the chat function. Now, okay, I start this with a prejudice, which is that one of the things the UK has got extremely bad at is looking at what works elsewhere in the world. We know we have our objectives. We then decide what to do based entirely upon our own views without consulting activities, people, history, research from around the rest of Europe and the rest of the world. This has got to stop. It's been brought into context today by the launch, for example, of the government's heat strategy, the decarbonisation strategy for domestic buildings, which makes absolutely no mention, not a single word, of how other countries are addressing exactly the same problem in their own domains. I'm going to talk about the European experience of encouraging active travel. Now, of course, this is a long history. Pedestrianisation has been going on for 50 years, very successfully in some places, not so successfully elsewhere. People have been trying to build up cycling infrastructure over time. All this has got much more intense over the last 10 years or so. And what I thought I'd do is spend a couple of days researching this because I think it's very important to the future of decarbonisation. So there was an intervention there. Did I miss it? No. Okay, I'll push on. And so what I've looked at across a wide variety of European countries, but I've ended up by focusing on 4 or 5 cities, is what we might choose to learn about what makes active travel successful and what are the indices which we might be looking to replicate in the UK, success or failure indices from around the rest of Europe. Now, I look then particularly at these 8 different things which might be taken to indicate the success or failure of projects. And I'm looking here at, on the left-hand side, at those 8 different things, and on the right-hand side, cities which have given me some data, because I like to use always numbers in this rather than fluffy ideas. Give me some data to put in front of you for the success or failure of what they've tried to achieve. And unsurprisingly, I've gone for those towns which have given the data and where the data is productive and shows that active travel makes a big difference. So I'm going to run through this. As I say, we should be over by 8 o'clock or so if I move fast, but it would be great if people intervened. I can't see the chat questions, so either Catherine or Andy will be able to speak. Right, first of all, the first of these then is noise. Here's an example. It's Aix-en-Provence in southern France, a beautiful town with a medieval, pre-medieval centre in some places, plus a large area of town built in the 18th century. This, you can see on the right-hand side, is one of the streets that lead into the Cours Mirabeau, which is the wonderful tree-lined, very wide street running from one side of the old part of Aix to the other. And this is what it was like in 2012. And the reason I focused on this is when Aix decided to do something about congestion. And in particular, this was pushed in Aix by the very high noise level in this street, the Rue d'Italie, which runs for about half a kilometre from, as I say, the Cours Mirabeau out to the peripherique of the town. The reason it's so noisy is that this is a narrow street with 4 or 5 story buildings alongside it, and the noise levels in the street were making it impossible for much else to happen. It was pedestrianised in 2012, and the noise level fell, according to the measures that Aix-en-Provence provided, from 67 decibels, which is just less than heavy traffic, to a level of 62, which is not far off the conversation that you'll probably have over dinner tonight. In other words, a massive difference. And it made it possible to revive local businesses which had been simply destroyed by the cars passing through. This was one early example. There on the red is Cours Mirabeau, the peripherique is the yellow road running in a sort of circle, and the Cours Mirabeau comes from the upper end of the red, the Rue d'Italie, And just a quick look at what happened to the Corps Mirabeau. The Rue d'Italie pedestrianisation was so successful that they decided to try and do the same thing across the whole of central Aix. And that's what's happened. So the whole area inside the yellow line is now pretty much pedestrianised. Of course, cars can come in, you can go through barriers and so on and so forth. And one of the things that I think we should be talking about is you don't need to absolutely prohibit cars for active travel to become a dominant feature of city centres. It's not a question of just simply saying you can't come in. You just make it slightly more difficult and you make cycling and pedestrian travel slightly more easy, and all of a sudden the percentages start changing round. This is the Cours Mirabeau, beautiful tree-lined street. I think, to my mind, almost the nicest place in Europe, which once in 2000 was changed in about 2016 as a result of that, and made into almost completely pedestrianised street now. Of course, it's mainly filled with tourists, but it has the most beautiful buildings in the world on either side, including the cafe where Cézanne was born and grew up as a child. And it's not just about closing things off. What Aix did at the same time was introduce a network of little buses, electric buses, that shoot around town, taking people who don't want to walk across the very limited distances to the external places where they can catch buses. Once again, a good example. Non-intrusive, small, doesn't make any noise, a very good addition to the lovely characteristics of Aix. So Aix is one example of a very broad theme across France as a whole. And that is to move from today's speed limits down to 30 kilometers an hour, that's about 20 miles per hour, across the whole town or city. So almost all the large towns and cities in France have now decided, or are in the process of implementing, a rule that all non-pedestrian, non-cycle traffic will have to move at 30 kilometers or less. And this has been driven both by experiences in places like Aix, but also the view that this is the way to get a reduction in road accidents and deaths and serious injuries from those road accidents. So that's the primary driver. But also, I just quoted here from a statement from the town and the city of Lyon, that it also believes that this also can cause a reduction in the noises linked to traffic across the city. My feeling, and it's only a feeling, it's not backed by much scientific data, that we will find that noise is an incredibly destructive part of the influence on traffic in large towns, both to health and to sense of well-being, and that the more we do to reduce noise within our cities, the higher standards of living we will all have. Health more generally. Well, I looked hard for towns that had actually, and cities that had actually measured how much they would save in healthcare costs, or indeed in life expectancy increases from an increase in cycling. They value cycling in terms of its health. And I have two numbers here. One of them is from Copenhagen and the other one is from Utrecht in Holland. In Copenhagen, they calculated that the value of a kilometer of cycling in terms of improved life expectancy and reduced health demands was approximately 60 euro cents. That doesn't sound a lot, but over the course of the year, Copenhagen values that at something like 225 million for its population. Utrecht came up with some higher numbers. It thought that the health benefits of moving to a fully, it's calculated that its policies on cycling and encouragement of cycling have added something like, have reduced its health costs by approximately 300 million euros a year. And it's put that against the cost of the cycling measures typically per year that it's had to introduce. And Utrecht is, of course, pretty much the world bicycle capital. As we'll see later, something like over 60% of all travel within Utrecht takes place on bicycles. It's got the biggest bicycle storage park in the world, and so on and so forth. But the aim of this analysis in Utrecht's case was to show its electorate that, look, this is costing money, but it's doing a lot for life expectancy and for demands on our health services. It more than pays the price. and that's the same true for Utrecht. Look a bit about accidents between people and vehicles of one form or another. And this is information from the city of Oslo, which saw a striking rise in the first part of the last decade to 2015 in the number of accidents and deaths and serious injuries that occurred within the city. This, as in the case of Lyon earlier, pushed the city dramatically to say, okay, well, this has got to stop. We want a town where death rates, accident rates are very much lower than we've got today. And the way we're going to do this is by making it more difficult to drive, by making parking more difficult to find, by cutting speed limits, and so on and so forth. So in Oslo, principally, it wasn't certainly much of a cycling town in 2015, according to the literature that I've read, has very significantly reduced the death rates from accidents of all forms as a result of changing its policies towards the medium of travel which people use, particularly encouraging cars and pedestrian traffic, for example. So that by 2019, in the whole of the city of Oslo, which has got a population of about 600,000, there was just one death from traffic. That was a motorist driving his car into a fence. It was nothing to do with a conflict between cars or a conflict between bicycles and cars. So very, very successful indeed at changing the health implications in terms of accidents as a result very quickly of a policy instituted in 2015. They measured it also in a slightly different way in Oslo. They looked at the deaths and serious injuries per million trips of cyclists, pedestrians, and drivers. And interestingly, between 2014 and 2018, 2014 was near the peak that we saw just on the chart previously. In all three cases, the number of deaths and serious illnesses and serious injuries fell, but for all three categories of transport users. The fall was greatest for cyclists, almost 50%, but also driving became safer and pedestrian travel as well. And that, I think, is an important lesson that these changes, the encouragement of active travel, is good news for drivers as well. It makes life safer for everybody. Travel speeds. Well, it was difficult to get data on this. I couldn't find what had happened to car travel, bus travel in any of the large cities which are good at reporting data. But what I did see was data on how fast bicycles went. And I looked particularly at Copenhagen. I've got a daughter who lives there who comments that the traffic jams are traffic jams of bicycles. And I thought to myself, does this mean that actually this change to active travel in Copenhagen has produced relatively slow commuting? No. The speed in Copenhagen, typically of a bike inside the main area of Copenhagen, is measured at 15.5 kilometers an hour. Over the course of a year, many millions of trips logged carefully. And that's significantly greater than the European average for cycling speeds in European cities of 11 or so kilometers per hour. And of course, it's faster than road travel by car in central London, which is also roughly around 11 kilometers an hour, and lower than that in much of the deep centre. So here's an argument that even by really pushing cycling so that it becomes the dominant form of transport within a city, which it is for Copenhagen, something like 70% of all journeys take place with a bike. It doesn't necessarily reduce the speed of travel. This is good for everybody. It's good for health, but it's also good at getting people from place to place quickly, which is one of the things, of course, we want.
Chris, I'm just seeing a question which I know relates back to the aches, but Steve Dawes asks, how did they reduce the traffic? If they didn't stop the traffic entirely, what was the technique used to dissuade people? Do you know?
They put barriers, contactless barriers, posts which rise and fall. So if you've got a right to drive in that area, you're the post office or you're a delivery driver, or you live in the area and you have a a place to park, which is pretty unusual given how crowded it is. You just wave your card at the barrier, and it falls and then rises again. So that's the way, for example, that the little buses that I showed get around.
Yes, somebody else was asking about the buses, and we're very Hugh Lee. Did I see an electric vehicle? And do you know anything about it? Is it free? Yes,
yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's absolutely free. You just put your hand up and the bus, and it stops. It's of course it's got a driver in it, and you get in the back, and it goes on a predetermined route. Very easy to use. It's aimed particularly at older folk who don't want to walk long distances, and it's a very effective part of the local.
Presumably, they're going past every 10 minutes or something.
Yeah. They're very frequent, and they interact well with people in the streets. The streets can be crowded. It's a very Aix is a town I know well. The streets can be crowded, but these things can nose their way through without any problem. There's a little jingling sound as they go, so you don't get hit from behind because you don't hear it. And it's an important addition to the local infrastructure, I think.
Thank you.
There's a question about Utrecht, Chris. Whether the Utrecht has the ability to take money from the health budgets to pay for the cycling infrastructure improvements.
I wish I know the answer to that. I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to that. I doubt it. But look, there may be someone in the audience who knows about the way that Dutch local authorities work. Utrecht probably, I suspect, doesn't control it. It was just trying to make the case in this argument that, look, you may think that this transfer is costing you a lot of money in your council tax equivalent, Mr. or Miss Utrecht resident, but actually it's doing a hell of a lot for the expenditure on health. And of course, none of us want to be the subject of health expenditure. So it works well with voters if you say, we have roughly extended life expectancy by half a year, which is what Utrecht goes around saying now. Less optimistic, incidentally, than Copenhagen about the impact of bicycling. But nevertheless, both of these two large cities agree that this is good for health and for life expectancy. But no, I don't think there was an explicit transfer. But of course, in a well-run democracy, the people of Utrecht ought to be able to move money from health to transport, or from transport to health. We certainly don't have that in the UK, of course.
Thanks.
Sorry, Andy.
No, sorry to have interrupted, but thanks. Do go on.
Not at all. So just to make the point once again that to look at pedestrian and cyclist travel numbers, what I wanted to show was that after active travel measures had been introduced, the encouragement of cycling and so on and so forth, there had been a big rise in the amount of in the number of both cycle users and pedestrians. And I haven't actually managed to find that with sufficient detail to give you a nice chart in here. But these are the numbers for Utrecht now, which says that something like 60% of all journeys in Utrecht are made by bike, and relatively small numbers by car at around 15%, and most of the remainder there is by walking. So in this town, Utrecht, bicycling has become utterly dominant as a means of getting around. And I think Utrecht is about 3-4 times the size of Oxford. There's no reason why we couldn't aim for something like that inside Oxford, although of course the changes would be politically extremely difficult to get through. I also looked and got some data on what's happened to journeys in Paris since the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo, has moved towards very active pushing both of things like a 30 km/h speed limit, which has just come into being, and also the much more easy access to dedicated cycling routes across the whole of the city. Of course, Paris is extremely dense. It's much more suited to cycling than some other places. But what she's shown is that it's possible, with some considerable opposition, but nevertheless, she's shown it's possible to push the number of cyclists up dramatically over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, with much still to come. Some of this is going to be COVID related, of course, but all this started in 2019 before the epidemic hit us. And we're now seeing continued growth in, continued growth in the use of scooters, of cycles, and of pedestrian journeys inside Paris. But, cycling is still only 15% of all journeys within Paris. So it's a very long way from Utrecht, but it's moving in the right direction. And it's proved politically possible to do something which I think even people in Paris would have said was very unlikely to be achieved when Anne Hidalgo took over in Paris, what was it, 5 years ago or so. And this is what the network in Paris will eventually look like. These are dedicated cycling routes, including, for example, along the Seine, which you may have read about, north-south routes, right out to the outer circle of the périphérique. So this is a dramatic plan with many hundreds of kilometers of dedicated cycle routes, and it's exactly what other towns and cities around Europe are seeking to copy. Very brave, very ambitious, expensive, not without its problems, but a route which I think many of us could copy. City centre economics. Now, this is a very complicated chart, and I apologize for it, but it gave some numbers which I couldn't find about anything else. What happens if you make a city centre basically only accessible by cycle and by walking? It's Copenhagen we're talking about here. You can drive in Copenhagen. In almost all the countries, the places I'm talking about, you can still drive. It's just more difficult, more inconvenient. There's less parking and so on and so forth. This data was trying to show commercial enterprises that there was still a very considerable amount of commerce happening within the central area of Copenhagen. It's probably too difficult to go through this, not enough time, but the revenue at the top left shows the amount of money that's being spent in Copenhagen by the means of transport which were used to get into Copenhagen. So walking and cycling is something over 50% in Copenhagen. It's about 70% of journeys underneath that for shopping. So people who are in cars are buying more in Danish kroner than they would do if they were cycling or shopping or on foot. But nevertheless, it's a good indication that bicycling is not destructive necessarily of money spending. And right on the bottom right are the figures in millions, billions of Danish kroner for the amount that's spent by people who bicycle, people who walk. This is an attempt to show that pedestrianisation, active travel, does not destroy local commerce. In fact, the very much reverse is true in the towns which have gone for this in a big way. Many of the people in this audience will know about Pontevedra in northwest Spain, perhaps the best example of a town that's really pushed this hard. This is the map which you're given if you come into Pontevedra about how to get around the town, the distances and the amount of time it's going to take you to move from one side of the city to another. Pontevedra is smaller than Oxford, but not that much smaller in terms of extent. Just an indication of the fact that once you run these things, and you can make it really quite quick to move from one place to another. Although in our case, Headington Hill might still represent a problem for those wishing to cycle that fast. City centre living. This is not just about the amount of money being spent, but how people spend their time living in city centres. Pontevedra is a very good example of a city centre that's been absolutely revitalised by active travel over a course of 20 years. So whereas other major cities in Spain have tended to lose population from the centre, Pontevedra has dragged people in because it's convenient, it's quiet, the commerce is there. You can move around easily either on cycle or on walking. And the same thing to some extent is true, to a lesser extent, is true in the case of Oslo, which started much later. Pontevedra started this 20 years ago. Oslo, as I said, is only 5 or 6 years. But Oslo has already concluded that it's good for attracting people. It's good for commerce inside the city centre, as well as all the other things we've mentioned, such as health and noise levels. So I mentioned Pontevedra. This is what Pontevedra looks like. It's a photograph. It doesn't look as it's photo. It's actually a photograph, but this is how the commerce has been revitalized. People have moved back. So whereas in Oxford, the second and third floors of shops tend to be unoccupied or barely used, in Pontevedra, they would typically be used for housing and so on and so forth. This is the sort of example of a way that a town like Oxford could revitalize itself during, if it moved away from a transport system dominated by cars, entirely dominated by cars. So in Oslo, just to conclude, although these conclusions are still a little bit tentative, what they're saying now is that once they've started it, they really think it's going to be successful and it's going to continue. More and more people, said the deputy mayor, that are actually seeing it's good for seeing that it's good for the city, and that's a conclusion that's made almost invariably by large cities and towns that move away from a car-dominated transport regime. They say it's good in every respect for the health of the town and its people, and this becomes it tends to become very popular. As is well known, the town of Pontevedra in Spain has re-elected its mayor 4 times since he and his party political colleagues started the process of building an active travel system in around the year 2000. And the same thing will probably happen, I suspect, in Oslo. There are examples, and we'll just talk briefly about the end, where there's been some resistance and things have been rolled back, but these are remarkably few that I could find across Europe. Last couple of points, making cycling more enjoyable. So one of the benefits of active travel is probably that it's more fun to cycle than it is at the moment. I cycled up and down the Botley Road on Sunday, and it was a truly horrible experience. And I'm sure everybody in this group has had very similar experiences at some point within the last week or so. But in Oslo, they've done a survey and they've looked at how satisfied were, and there's quite a lot of data in this survey if anybody's very interested in it, not just to do with commuting, but this is what people say about their commuting since active travel was introduced in 2015 and later. And in the case of both cyclists, cars, and also in pedestrians, the satisfaction with the commuting process has gone up. So it's good for everybody. It's not just a benefit to cyclists to move to active travel. So some conclusions and generalizations. Almost invariably, as I've suggested, if a European city has put its money and its political capital into active travel, cycling and pedestrianisation, most of them have seen stunning success. There are some exceptions. There's been a rollback in Madrid and in Edinburgh as well. We call that a European city. But those are the only ones that I could find. There may be people in the audience who know elsewhere. But in general, the momentum seems to be increasing. People, particularly, for example, in French cities, are dramatically changing attitudes towards the accessibility of city centres to cars. Nobody talks about completely banning them, but it's just making it less unattractive, fewer parking spaces, and so on and so forth. Lessons learned, what works and what doesn't work? Well, if you looked at Pontevedra, it was a big plan carried out effectively over a long period of time, pulling the community with it. Having that well-defined plan to begin with, telling people before you start it what you're doing, also seems to work. That's worked, I think, in Paris with Anne Hidalgo. Third point is what's pushed a lot of these towns and cities to do things actively is having a problem that really seriously, obviously needs dealing with. In the case of Oslo, that was the surprising and striking rise in road accidents. In Oxford, I think it should be, for example, noise, traffic, environmental pollution. But I don't see enough momentum behind that yet. Fourth point is, in some places, a clear link in people's minds inside the political system, the policy-making system, between active travel and 15-minute cities, the ability to get whatever you want, laundry, your groceries, a mechanic to deal with a problem with your bicycle, all within a 15-minute active travel radius. And the last point is politicians who are prepared to stake things on this. We don't really seem to have that in the UK, but in other countries where we've seen active travel being successful around Europe, political leadership has been able to push these things through. I look forward to an interesting discussion.
So there are a couple of questions, Chris, slightly linked about how we can change the way people think here, and also about short-termism, making people see the longer view. So how can we change the way people look at it in this country?
Well, I think one suggestion might be to try and build an effective, easy to communicate database about what's going on in the rest of the world. For example, to show people that introducing active travel does not destroy local commerce, quite the reverse. In the area where I live in North Oxford, the Walton Street traders were apparently fiercely opposed to the low traffic neighborhood proposals, and that's what probably ended up by stopping that what looked to me to be a very effective idea, in the belief that they would lose their trade. I think absolutely the reverse would have occurred. And we need to show that in countries where this has happened, it hasn't resulted in city centres dying and shops having to close. Quite the reverse. Pontevedra in Spain, as I say, has gained population. It has kept a large number of independent shops open in the city centre, which have had to close elsewhere in other large or medium-sized Spanish cities. It's a very difficult question, but step one would be to try and understand what's happening elsewhere in the world. Britain isn't an exception. We follow pretty much the same rules as everywhere else. We just need to be able to marshal the evidence to show that things can be done differently.
Thanks, Chris. And Marcus Simmons asked, what can we learn from those two examples of failures? Do you feel there's anything from Madrid and Edinburgh that...
Well, look, I'm not an expert on this, and as I say, there'll be people in the room that know far more about this than I do. But what I've read in the course of the last 2 days suggests that in Madrid, the rollback has been due to the fact that it was a policy pushed by one political party and therefore opposed by another, and the election was partly fought on the issue of cutting car use, and the opponents won that election, and as a result just dived in and tried to, and are in the process of unwinding it. Don't know the details, please forgive me. That's as much as I've absorbed. And Edinburgh is different. I think it was just too radical a proposal for congestion charging and things like that at the time. There might be more stomach for it now. But I think the lesson is that this really has to be something that's agreed across the major political groupings, particularly as in this country where we have a widening divide between a left-facing political entity or groups of political entities and those people on the political right. If everything's always contested, if something the right says is always opposed by the left and vice versa, it's going to be very difficult to get any form of radical change across almost any part of political life through the system. We need to try to rebuild. I'm going into almost philosophy here, please forgive me. We need to completely rebuild our political system so that dialogue across party political divides can restart.
One of the complaints that people have when you introduce an LTN is that it causes a lot of traffic outside the car-free zone. Do you know of cities where that's happened or where they've dealt with that problem?
Well, the evidence for that is quite mixed, isn't it? Yes, you see evidence. You see some people saying, "Oh, that we put the LTN up." Sorry, I've forgotten where it is exactly in Cowley, but and as a result, all the traffic goes on the other roads. But in the places I've studied this hasn't happened. There hasn't been a diversion. There's been a net diminution in traffic. Now, of course, this will be subject to, it will be dependent upon exactly how traffic flows around a town. But the lesson there might be that you have to do this on a relatively big scale. So you can't just take one street and make it into a low traffic neighborhood. You need to make it across an area so that you just don't move it from one street to the next one long. But I think it is striking how other countries, for example, Aix-en-Provence, managed to do this without creating a similar problem.
Thank you, Chris. Brian Robertson asks, could you say anything about what he calls carrot policies? Apparently in Belgium, commuters are paid 17 cents a kilometre to go by bike.
Yeah, I did see that. I didn't know that it was actually active in Belgium, but yes. So thank you very much for that. I'll have a look at that. But it's repeatedly mentioned that this is the right way. The incentives for bicycle travel. So as it were, a negative meter on your bicycle. That every circuit that the wheel does, you get paid a small amount of money. Look, this might make a lot of sense. Personally, I think the UK is going to have to move to. I'm going to stop sharing, by the way, so that we can talk to each other more. The UK is going to have to move to some form of charging per mile driven as electric vehicles take over, and therefore the revenues from excise duties fall away. We are going to have to move to start charging people by the mile. And at the same time, perhaps we could introduce a system of paying people by the mile. I think, is it Belgium? I'm sorry for not having done the research properly here, but there's certainly some proposals to oblige companies to pay people more in their salary if they have come to work by bicycle. Look, that works for some people, but relatively small number of us. In 10 years' time, I suspect are going to be working in a central office where that's the case. But yes, I think it's a very interesting idea to try and actively encourage cycling, because if Copenhagen is right, it's worth 60 € a kilometre to the Copenhagen health system to have people riding their bikes around the town.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, Bolton Forest actually hired a PR group to do some advertising for them. Do you think this is a good idea?
Waltham Forest to do for LTNs? Oh, sorry, or for what?
I was trying to find that question. Yeah.
Yes, it was.
They had hired an advertising company to promote their LTN schemes. Yeah. So.
Well, it needs some good stories, doesn't it? Whether it was right to hire an advertising agency, but I tend to. Sorry.
They used the company up the road who promoted the 2012 Olympics.
Right.
To promote the LTN schemes.
Did it work?
It was them to help move the traders around. Because all the traders thought everyone drove there, and it worked.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So it ended up by convincing people through the use of example that this wasn't going to be a disaster for them.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. I look at I know Walton Street best, and the failure of the LTN there. That would have made such a difference to the shops in the middle of the junction of Walton Street and Kingston Road. I'm sure the case is made elsewhere in Oxford as well. So we do need some form of education process to show. I've been trying to push the idea of this is completely off the topic, but trying to take taking the idea of getting some sheep farmers in the areas where sheep farming is going to become uneconomic, and try to persuade them to become foresters by taking them to attractive places of Italy and Austria, where they gave up on sheep farming 100 years ago and are now making far more out of forestry than our farmers would do out of sheep. Just showing people that things really can be very different, and it's not necessarily bad news to move to a low carbon to a lower carbon world.
Chris, you've said that Britain doesn't seem to be very good at learning from our European neighbours. One person, Hugh Lee, asks, do you know if they have electric scooters all over the place in European cities? And where do you think they fit into the scheme of things?
How do people? I think they're a wonderful idea. You know, there's a scooter park 100 meters from me. It's been there for 3 or 4 weeks, and it seems to be very actively used. And I think it's a big step forward. I don't know what Hugh thinks. Certainly, by the way, the massive quantities in Paris. That's a town where I've seen it. I have to say, it looks frighteningly dangerous to me, but I'm probably too old.
Thanks. And do you think, just to continue on that theme, you know, I mean, we're not that different from Europe really, but somehow we never seem to take notice of good examples. How might this change? Where do you think they?
I don't know. I don't know where it comes from. It's getting worse and worse. Have a dialogue going. I mean, you know, during the course of the research in the last couple of days, I've been to, obviously online, to various seminars which have taken place where experiences are being discussed between cities, major cities in Europe. Of course, it's all being discussed in English, but there are no British participants to these things. It's absolutely terrifying how little notice how we're just simply not observing what's happening in the rest of the world. I mean, it was true with masks as well. It became completely clear very early on in other European countries that masks were vital for public health. It took a month or so before we learned that lesson, because we don't bloody read European scientific press.
The other part of the challenge, as it were, is making public transport more appealing. In your research, were there any key messages? I suppose I'm mostly thinking about pricing and regulation. Do you think that there's any way we can improve our public transport systems here so that people are more willing to get on buses?
You know, I think if we manage to reduce cars, public transport would inherently become more attractive. So I've just seen something flashing up on the screen about Westgate. I'm sorry, I didn't catch the name of the person who said it, who asked it, but there's an example. If Westgate didn't exist, the speed of buses on Botley Road would probably be twice what it is today. If we actively discourage, I don't know how we would do this given the amount of money that Westgate probably thinks is at stake, but the owners of Westgate think is at stake. But we absolutely do need to stop very large numbers of cars coming in on the arterial routes into park in Westgate, because of its, amongst other things, because its destructive impact on public transport and on cycling.
Catherine, how are we doing? Any other questions?
I think we've got most of them. Well, somebody's asked, what was your one cheap thing? What would you do if you had one cheap thing you could do? What would you do to cut traffic in Oxford?
I would reduce the amount of car parking in central Oxford.
Yeah, that's a popular choice.
I would simply just cut. No parking in Broad Street, no parking in St Giles, and so on and so forth. I absolutely can't see the point of it.
Well, having tried to close Broad Street just for a day, it's the revenue they get for the parking. That's what you're up against.
Yeah, but it's not that, it can't be that much.
It's $500,000 a year for the Broad Street 25 or 35 parking spaces, apparently. You're right, it's in the scheme of things, it's nothing.
But yeah, 500,000 is a lot. I agree. I mean, it's difficult. It would be very difficult for the city to simply throw that away. Thank you, Deborah. I didn't realize it. I wouldn't have guessed it was anything like as much as that.
Yes, and Giles will be something probably even more.
What you could get from renting that space out to street food, I don't know. It wouldn't be, clearly wouldn't be 500,000 though.
The issue, I've been watching Dan Levy's comments, and I think he's the only county councillor who's listening. And I wonder whether Dan would like to say anything, because with a new administration and with the fact that the coalition are going to be talking in a month's time to this group, is there anything, Dan, that you'd like to say at this point? What you've heard from Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. Yeah, I mean, I've been listening with great interest, and I'm extraordinarily jealous that authorities in other parts of Europe have the power to do the things they've done, because we certainly don't within local government in England have nearly any of the same powers. And so we can't control bus pricing. We can't replace car park charge income, for example, and we can't willy-nilly stop cars, much as we would like to. So I'm afraid you're going to have to be a bit patient, but we do want to end up in the same sort of position that other places have got to, and there is the political will to do that. So, for example, today you'll have noticed that effectively we said that the default speed limit in all of our built-up areas will be 20 miles an hour, not 30. We've persuaded Thames Valley Police that I'll actually put some enforcement into that, and we're very hopeful that that will make some difference to the safety of people cycling. Now, we can't do everything. We've been in with the new administration for 5 months. We've got 3.5 years to go before the electorate can either approve of what we're doing or not approve of what we're doing. But we are determined that we will end up with fewer cars, more active travel, less carbon emissions in our cities and towns and villages, and with better public transport. But there's a hell of a lot to do, so give us a little bit of a break, and then I won't have to be quite as negative and defensive in responding to comments. But we will get there.
Thanks, Dan. And Tim, sorry.
There's a question also, which actually very relates to what Dan's saying about mental health as well, and the effect of cycling on mental health. Any research on that, Chris?
I came across bits and pieces, but it wasn't quantitative in a way that I could sort of put into a bar chart. But it does strike me as utterly vital. Your connection with a town, your sense of place, your sense of being a citizen of a place is vastly enhanced by walking and cycling around, as opposed to getting in your sealed 1-ton piece of metal. So my guess is that any analysis, and I'll have a look if it's interesting, and see if I can find any, will show that active travel is vastly better for our mental health.
And just to go on about the parking, because I do agree, if in Broad Street we see cars circling around trying to find somewhere to park, and if there just was nowhere, they wouldn't come in. The other challenge, of course, is stopping through traffic with connecting Oxford. But I wonder if Tim Schickel would be prepared to just say, because he says there are some plans to close Broad Street. Tim, are you there? Ah, yes.
I am. Hello, good evening. There is plans being looked at the moment from a design perspective to pedestrianise Broad Street, and that is one of Councillor Bearder's little projects. I'm sure he won't mind me saying that ahead of him. And it's something we're looking at. I think we're trying to strike the balance from county, because we've got so I've got to walk around with Thames Valley Police next week, for example, and looking at how we try and keep hostile vehicles out of the public spaces as well. So there's all sorts going on. But yeah, Broad Street is on the cards for being Certainly car free. I think we're struggling slightly with the buses at the moment, but it would be a far reduced area. But I think there's a general willingness, and I know there's been conversations around St Giles, but I think we'll struggle with that one with the university. I mean, certainly from an officer level and in the administration level, there is a real desire to try and push things through and help make the city better. There's some obviously big infrastructure coming through, and big infrastructure change on Woodstock Road and Banbury Road as well. So there's a lot in the pipeline at the moment.
Tim, you should just say what your role is so that people know.
I'm one of the group managers for highways, and I look after traffic and road safety. But at the moment, I'm leading on the 20 mile an hour project across the whole of Oxfordshire. So it's that's been my bag at the moment. And I was very involved with Walton Street. I'm nothing to do with bollards, so please don't shoot me. I hate the things, and I completely agree that they need to work. But yeah, Walton Street again was a real eye-opener, and it did make me realise that you cannot do stuff in isolation. It has to be a much bigger picture, because otherwise it just creates mayhem. So yes, very sad it didn't work, because there was a lot of work went into that. But yeah, thank you very much. It's been really interesting, and Chris, yeah, fascinating insight. Thank you very much.
Well, I think we can wrap up there. I'm just checking, but various people saying thank you. And
congestion around the hospital was another thing, but yeah.
Mm.
But there's been a lot of comments in the chat. The chat's been really good. So
yeah, thank you. Well, thank you to everybody for contributing, and it will be a discussion which will continue. And thank you very much, Chris, for the research and presenting it, and hope to continue the conversation. Last word to
Lovely.
you.
Oh, thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure, and it's an extraordinarily interesting area. So let's keep talking about it.
Transport is the easiest to solve if you're thinking of climate change. So
yeah, home heating's a lot more difficult, but the government started on that today. But I think, as I said at the beginning, it would have been much better if it had decided to absorb the lessons from other countries, which it has not.